So let's talk a little bit about resending a transaction with RBF. So if your Bitcoin transaction gets stuck and you are the sender of that transaction, you can resend using RBF or replace by a fee. However, that's not all RBF is good for or can do. It's generally like quite a powerful feature that allows for many different scenarios. So there might be the simple scenario of your Bitcoin transaction getting stuck, and in order to get it mined in a future block, you increase the transaction fee. There might be a scenario where you send a transaction, but maybe you want to send more or less, and so you restructure the transaction to use a new set of UTXOs. And so those are some of the scenarios that RBF would be useful in. So RBF as a feature is opt-in. So it's an opt-in Bitcoin feature. And so what that means is you have to specify explicitly whether or not you want a transaction to be eligible for RBF. And this is done by adding sequence numbers to your UTXO. So when you create a raw transaction and you include in your inputs field some UTXO transaction IDs, you also need to add a variable called sequence, which is a number between 0 and some really large number. And then that will indicate that you want to make the transaction available for RBF. So if I create a raw transaction now myself, I'll just copy and paste the command in so you don't have to watch me type it out and explain what it's doing. Maybe make this a little bit smaller. And what's happening here is that, similarly to what you've seen before, I'm storing the result of creating a raw transaction in a raw variable called raw_tx_hex. I'm calling create raw transaction. I've got all my variables set up, so I've grabbed a transaction ID from the list of unspent UTXOs as well as the number associated with that set. And then this is something that we haven't seen before. So this is the sequence number that I was referring to just a minute ago. And this indicates that we want to make this transaction available for RBF. Bitcoin recommends setting this number to 1, but typically this number is auto-generated. If you want to make all transactions available for RBF, you can restart your Bitcoin daemon and run it again by using the wallet RBF flag, and this will make all your transactions available for replace by fee. So now that we've created a raw transaction, the process is exactly the same as what we've done before. So we're going to sign our transaction and then we're going to send it. So similarly to what we've done before, we can sign our transaction with wallet. And then the last thing will be to send our transaction with the send raw transaction command. And so this returns a hex, or this returns us a transaction ID, which we can use to investigate what has actually happened with this transaction. So let's call the Bitcoin CLI get transaction command. If I can type and my terminal doesn't freeze. So Bitcoin CLI using the named flag and calling the get transaction command and passing in a transaction ID. Cool. So as you can see, we don't have any confirmations, and the BIP125 replaceable value is equal to yes. So typically this is equal to no, indicating that this transaction isn't replaceable. And we'll talk a little bit more about like what BIP125 actually means and what it signifies. But as long as this value remains yes, this transaction will remain available for RBF until we get at least one confirmation, at which point this value will be no. So the easy way to replace this transaction is to use the bump fee command, and this will basically increase the transaction fee for this transaction. So in order to do that, this is essentially the easy way. We can call the Bitcoin CLI again, and using the named flag, call the bump fee command and pass in the transaction ID we've just created. And what that would do is return us the transaction ID for the new transaction we just created using that command, the original fee that was associated with that transaction, and the new fee. So as you can see, the fees increased slightly, and that would increase our chances of getting the transaction mined and into a block. Talk a little bit about this BIP125 replaceable key, and like what is BIP125 and what are some of the rules around RBF. So BIP125 is BIP125 is or BIPs in general rather stands for Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, and it's basically like an in-depth suggestion for a change in the Bitcoin core code. So BIPs are sufficiently discussed and updated, and they can take quite a while for the community to come to consensus about whether what's being proposed is good for the community as a whole, and whether or not it warrants being merged into the code base or not. So let's have a look at one. So BIP125, let me get the link for it here. So if you're not familiar, this is GitHub. This is basically a platform for hosting code or software projects basically. And this is what a BIP essentially looks like. It gives you a bit of information about like what number this is and who the authors were, the title. So in this case is opt-in full replaced by fee signaling. And then this is like some documentation of like the proposal. So an abstract and a summary and some of the implementation details. So for RBF to be, some of the rules around RBF can be seen here. So a couple are: the original transactions signal replaceability explicitly or through inheritance as described in the above summary section. So that's basically referring to adding the sequence number in the raw transaction we just created. Another one is the number of original transactions to be replaced and their descendant transactions, which will be evicted from the mempool, must not exceed a total of 100 transactions. So I definitely recommend having a look at this proposal and others just to get more understanding of some of the processes that are actually in place to improve the Bitcoin core software. This section is quite interesting, and it talks about like some of the motivation behind RBF and the original implementation by Satoshi Nakamoto. And you can actually have a look at how it was implemented in code as well by looking at a PR. So without going again into too much detail, a PR is a pull request which can be reviewed by other developers and anyone basically to understand how this was implemented in code. So you can have a look at what files have changed, and people leave comments on specific parts of the code. Maybe it's the code needs to be improved, or maybe it needs to be optimized in specific ways. And so if you want to get an even deeper understanding, you can always learn code and learn the language that Bitcoin Core is written in to understand deeper how some of this stuff gets implemented. But it goes through quite a vigorous testing process, and there's many eyeballs on Bitcoin Core. So it's not easy to get stuff merged in, essentially. So yeah, I think that's about it for this video. Just to recap then, so if a transaction is stuck and you don't want it to expire, you can use the replace by fee functionality, and this will allow you to basically double spend your transaction. So it's important to note that double spending can only occur if a transaction hasn't been confirmed yet. Once it has at least one confirmation, it's irreversible due to the fact that Bitcoin has an immutable ledger. So once a transaction goes into a block, it basically can't be reversed. So this is one of the instances where double spending is permitted. And you might send a transaction, and then before it's confirmed, combine it with a second transaction, and this allows you to compress multiple transactions down into a single one, and that would mean that you can decrease your overall fees. So RBF's a really nice feature. It's something that hopefully more wallets will implement going forward. And if you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. I hope this was valuable and made sense, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.